Welcome to Literacy Geek Show. We are your hosts, Jonathan Lemaster and Lee Ramsey. The goal of our Literacy Geek Show is to inspire educators and spark great conversation that helps students meet and exceed reading and writing standards. Join us as we geek out about our journey to revolutionize literacy instruction. All right, Lee, today we are talking about, or geeking out about, how to help students with their text-dependent writing skills. And I think the goal for today, because this is becoming more of a series, is focusing on integrating sources. And some people like to talk about it as introducing sources. So we've got these two skills that we're talking about today that build that ability, that skill ability that kids need in order to successfully participate and pass these text-dependent writing tasks. So we start off with a little bit of context. We did a deep dive into the college and career readiness standards. And not to our surprise, we found that there were 6 standards that were called out specifically for this type of task. 6 standards. And we thought it would be good. Lee and I talked about before the show, is it important to go over these standards? Do people know them? How well do they know them? And I think it's just important for us just to identify what they are. So instead of reading them all, we're just going to take pieces of them. So you get the kind of breadth of the work and how important, how essential introducing sources is, and why we're focusing on it today, and why we need to continue to support our students as they learn the skill. So ironically, R1, which is a reading standard, talks about citing textual evidence. And we could talk about that. I think we're going to talk in the next show, and how the reading and writing relationship works with text-dependent writing. But R1, cite textual evidence. Then let's go to the writing standards. W1, support claims with relevant evidence. That's going to be for the argument standard. So the Common Core or the College Career Readiness standards have argument, then informational, and then narrative. So W1 is that argument, supporting your claims with sources. W2 is the informational writing, and it says develop the topic with concrete details and quotations. Okay, so we're still using sources here. W6 says conduct short research drawing on several sources. So now we're talking about synthesizing sources. W7 refers to gathering information from multiple sources and using them in your writing. And W8 says draw evidence from literary and informational text to support your analysis. So here we are, we have 6 standards that are all about introducing and integrating sources into writing. And we have to just pause for a minute and say, that is a ton of standards for something that we sometimes just see randomly in a rubric, or sometimes not at all, by the way, in a rubric. And then we have these states that are administering tests that ask students to engage in these text-dependent tasks, these text-dependent analysis. Well, it's no wonder, right? Look at all the standards that this type of question, this text-dependent analysis question, asks of kids and what they have to know. And I think the goal for today is to dig into that, to understand what it means to introduce and integrate a source. Why is that important? And as more and more states bring these types of texts into their testing environments or into their statewide tests, we really need to get to the bottom of it, right? I mean, I think that's what's so important.
I think from the last episode, what was so interesting is when we started with, how do we help students grow with text-dependent writing? And, your first comment was like the next sub-skill down of introducing and integrating sources. And then I was really blown away when you mentioned your gut led you down a direction where you practiced it every week. We were talking about it earlier. You call this the essential skill.
Yeah.
And I love that. It's kind of the puzzle piece, one of the major puzzle pieces that's so important for a student to be able to successfully write about a source. And so I know the standards are pointing us in the direction. I love love to hear your gut and your experience in the classroom, and hearing that this skill that's not even said once really inside of the standards. It's we are inferring it from the other words that are being used, right? It
Yeah.
nowhere says introducing or integrating, and it could be the number one key thing to focus on, and it's so cool. So we're dedicating this podcast to that, and
Yeah.
seeing what we can do to help.
Right. So what is the issue then? If you hit on one, which is kind of amazing, it has to be inferred. You have to get a what we call unpack the standard to better understand what we need, what kids need, what we need to do as educators. But what's missing in our instructional practice? What's missing, and where are the opportunities to build students up to get them prepared to do this kind of work?
Yeah, I think we were chatting about it earlier, and the first thing that came to mind was I feel like there might be more of an importance on the ability to go find sources
Mm,
and to go research, um, than actually introduce them. And I feel like that might come back from the research standards. When that's what I remember, having a research project. Through our conversations, I've realized how this is, after you find all that research, you do that, really trying to make sure, you're integrating and summarizing what they've said in
mhm.
a very intelligent way. And that, to me, is is kind of a gap in maybe where we haven't made it there in education, or just the curriculum hasn't caught up with
Mm.
being able to support this type of writing.
Yeah. Yeah. You talk about research, and it makes me think of two things. Number one, you and I obviously grew up doing research projects. They're my air quotes there around research projects. And I do that because a lot of it was just kind of finding information and transferring it from one space to another, one medium to another. But one thing that I try to tell teachers is when you assign research, there's a real danger because we lose control of our sources.
Mhm.
And if I don't have control of my source, then I am not going to be able to help my students read it with any kind of strategy, or understand, is this a credible source or not credible source, or is this a source that's actually related to your topic or not related to your topic? It's kind of mildly related to your topic. That's one area of concern. The other is, like you said, we're spending a lot of time maybe assigning research because we think that's what happens in college, which we know isn't necessarily the case. You
Mhm.
don't have a bunch of professors assigning a bunch of research projects. What you actually see happening is professors expecting students to use sources for writing new arguments, supporting information, supporting claims that they're making. And research is not what you immediately see, yet that's the go-to. Is I'm going to do research, and then it's kids like it because they get to choose their own topic and they're writing, and that's fine. And there are some states that actually have added to the CCRs full sections called research.
Mhm.
And that's great too, because those skills are important. We talked about that too before the show. It's like getting a kid to be able to find those sources and use them, gather them, understand what you all of that's really, really important. But when you start writing with them, that's where it becomes really essential. And in the space of argumentation, you're really not just transferring information from one page to another page. You actually have to use it to effectively and strategically, and all of that requires careful integration of your sources. All of that requires real skill that has to be practiced. So the idea of achievement gaps, I've been really big on pushing. you know I want us to, not you and me, but I would love to see education continue to move away from the conversation of achievement gap and more into the conversation of opportunity gap.
Mhm.
When I talk about, and you and I have talked about achievement versus opportunity, what are your thoughts about that, and how are they different? How is moving from achievement gap changing the way we think about instruction, and maybe helping our kids out? Because we're kind of shifting the way we're thinking about gaps. Maybe you can explain a little bit of that for us.
Yeah, we've chatted about this here and there, and I think the achievement gap is really putting it on the student,
Mm,
and an opportunity gap almost is, in my eyes, it's an opportunity for the educators, the administrators, to start to see where there's gaps, where
mm,
they're not practicing the skills enough,
mm,
which is causing the achievement gap problem, right?
right.
And if we can talk about it in a positive way, I think it's always a better direction for us, right?
Mhm,
So just positive language for one, but for two, really looking inward and understanding where, how are they not receiving the practice necessary to master the skill. I think that's the big thing. And we were chatting about standard and skill, and with the
yeah.
new standards, they're really, a standard really is now the skill,
Mm,
which we love,
mhm,
but we still hear the language so differently. When we're in conversations with administrators or administrators at the district level, they don't really say the word skill. It's all standard. And when we're in conversations with teachers in the classroom, we're hearing the word skill a lot more, and where
mhm,
standard really isn't used that often.
mhm,
And I think we should really, maybe this is an opportunity gap for the classroom teacher and the district administrator to get on the same page,
mhm.
and really standard slash skill, like really start to push those words together, make them synonymous. I think would be so important, especially when you're talking about reading and writing standards. They are all really the ability, how well someone can read, how well someone can write, right?
Mhm.
So I think that's just such an important shift that would help the whole education industry, talk to each other a little bit better. So
Yeah, that's an amazing point. Just the language gap. There's a need for common vocabulary. There's a need for common meaning. What does it
yeah,
mean when we say teach the standards, or what does it mean when I say I'm teaching a skill? What skill are you really teaching? I think that's fascinating. And I think
yeah.
there might be a gap around, we throw the word out, college and career readiness or CCRs, and district administrators definitely will say CCRs a lot, right?
Mm,
Um, but I think what's fascinating is perhaps even I don't even know if there was formal training of why did they call them college and career readiness? It's
mm,
like why, is it because the college going culture, we're all going to college, and so we're just going to call our standards college. And I
mm,
think there's more to it than that. When the college and career readiness standards were created, they were created with university professors and community college professors and high school teachers. They were really designed, and experts in the field, to find what are the skills that kids need to know to be successful in college. Because we talked about this last time, this massive shift to a college going culture. Now everyone's going to college. What do they need to know? And so if six of the standards in the CCRs, the college and career readiness standards, are pointing to introducing and integrating sources, then we need to really pay attention to that, because there's a finite amount of these standards, which is nice. There's not a ton of them. Six of those 18 standards are about introducing and integrating sources. That's tremendous. And the
yeah,
reason why is because every college professor, every community college professor who sat on those committees knows that kids graduating high school and going to college have to be able to write about sources.
mm,
They have to be able to do that. It is an absolute must skill for kids as they enter into year one, year two college. And we see kids dropping out of school for lots of different reasons, but we can't ignore the fact that a lot of kids drop out because they're just not ready for it. They're not ready for the rigorous ways of thinking and knowing and doing that exist at college. And the CCRs were really designed to help kids be successful when they transition. So I think
yeah.
it's fascinating.
It is. It's so important. And now we're thinking about the prerequisite of this. What's the next prerequisite? So, is there any prerequisites here for introducing sources?
We assume the kids understand what is being written at such a level that they can determine if the source is credible, if the
Mm,
source is reliable, if the source is adequate to use it as a response or as support. They have to understand it in order to use it effectively. So we go back to a lot of reading skills, close reading skills that have to be taught before we can even get into telling kids how to use a source. And if
Mm.
we talk about a lot of in Literacy Geeks about transferability, if we're helping kids read closely, but we're not explicit, and we're making all the handouts and we're doing all the thinking, but they are practicing close reading, that doesn't have as much transferability as us giving kids the ownership of close reading by teaching them skills and then asking them which skill would you use here, which skill would you use there, making them more strategic in why you would choose a strategy versus another. Getting them to learn those close reading skills will transfer to an assessment, a text dependent assessment, where they have a source or two or four that they have to read, right? And
Mm.
then they have to then use the source. So, I mean, there's so many prerequisite skills that come with this that you can't just be like, all right, today we're doing introducing sources and that's it. I mean, you've got to spend a week alone looking at the text that they're going to be introducing and digging into it and understanding it before you could even start writing about it.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
It's
interesting.
interesting. Yeah, I remember all the trainings we would have. It didn't matter what the subject was. The first thing you'd start with is, do they understand the prompt and what they're supposed to do? And I think the longer you taught, the more you realized they had no clue. They skimmed it. They didn't dig into it. And so it's kind of interesting. This is very similar. For them to talk about the text, they have to understand it at a deep level. They will have had to have read it a few times. Really look for certain pieces that they want to talk about, and what the writer is doing, and that's a challenge if they're not practicing that in the classroom, right? So I know one of the things that we pride ourselves on is trying to help implement this in the classroom. So Jonathan, maybe you can. We were thinking maybe you could show the screen and maybe go through a few of the ways that you taught this in the classroom and help kids practice it on a weekly basis.
Yeah, we're gonna try this out. We're gonna just show a few things on our screen as Lee suggested here, and I'm gonna start from the verbs themselves. So we're talking about prerequisite skills, and if we're talking about helping kids introduce a source, we obviously need to teach them things like, is this a poem, is this an article, is this a short story, what is the genre that we're reading? That's critical, instead of just saying in the text, right? What text? The more specific we can be, the better, clearer we're going to be with our reader, the more they're going to understand, the stronger our arguments can be if we're really controlling our source. So what is this text? And then who is the author? And I would always tell my students, if we don't have an author, we probably shouldn't be reading it.
Hmm.
And that's because I don't know who this person is, and I can't use any of the person's background in my introduction. If I wanted to use it for credibility, I'll talk about that in just a minute. And then I need to understand what the writer is doing. And to a lot of people who don't have a background in reading, academic literacy, we authors do things in text, right? They illustrate things, they argue things, they challenge things, they extend ideas, they complicate issues. And so I want my students to be able to identify what a writer is doing, and so that I can use the source effectively. So they need words, they need verbs to use. So author X what? Argues, or is the author listing, or is the author summarizing, or is the author critiquing, or is the author stating something? So this list is one of the lists that you could use with your students to not only get them away from saying says, author X says, which is not a strong verb, but more importantly, it's not clear. It's not clear where this writer stands on the issue that you're talking about. And that's why says is not an effective verb when you're writing with sources. You want to use a verb that aligns to what they're really up to. What are they trying to do? And so if you can identify that, then you can be clear for your readers who are reading your work. And then from there, we have sentence starters. A lot of these handouts we can make available in our Geek Gazette. And if you're listening, what I'm trying to do is I'll try to read these to you so you can hear them instead of just seeing them. But please check out the video cast on our YouTube channel. But the introducing sources templates now takes those strong verbs and asks the students to think about, okay, I need a couple of things to introduce. I need the author's name, I need that strong verb, and then I need what the author says, whether that be paraphrased or cited directly or quoted directly, right, from the text. So
Mhm.
there's a couple of templates that you can use to do this to help students get familiar with how to introduce a source. And if you go look at any academic work, you're going to see these templates here. You know, author's name, X argues that blah, 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 blah. According to author Y, da, 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 da. In the article, name of the article, author Z argues that, contends that, summarizes the work of. And so, as a reader, when I'm reading this source integration, I get a lot of good information. I get who is speaking, what text is this coming from, what is this person's position based on the verb, and then what does the person say? You're getting a ton of information, and perhaps, Lee, more importantly, is these source introductions really separate my voice from someone else's voice. So
Mhm.
students need to learn how to clearly show when they're speaking, when they've stopped speaking, and when now they're bringing someone else's voice into their writing. That needs to be crystal clear. And that, I think, is a challenge for a lot of young writers. They don't really know how to make those academic, I'm going to use a writing term here, moves, MOVES, moves. They don't know how to use those academic moves. And so these templates, sentence starters, are really useful. And then the last one is a template like this. And this is where we're getting the integrating sources. So, all right, so we had our verbs, and then we had our sentence starter, right, to introduce the source with maybe some attribution, giving some credibility to the author. Who is this person? Why would I be using this person? And then they make two more moves to integrate completely, and that's to interpret what has been quoted here and to evaluate its significance.
Mhm.
And that would be kind of like a full um, introduction and integration with a
Mhm.
source. So I just want to kind of get your, because you're always like, um, obviously I'm on the education side and you're on the ed tech side. So when I go through some of this stuff, you have these like really cool ahas. So
Mhm.
share as I'm closing this out. What are something you're thinking?
Yeah, I think it's the handout before this one, the introducing, super interesting. I feel like there's just a few words when you're introducing, really, and that's where the power is. I think that's kind of cool. I love to simplify everything, so just seeing the two or three words, and then you've always said to improve your writing, use better verbs. So it's really what you're doing. It's a very specific place, and then you're concentrating on this, and it makes me see how important of an aspect
Mhm.
talking about the source, and why this is, why you like the source, or what is it about this source, and how it fits to what you're talking about. It is starting to become crystal clear in my mind how this makes text dependent writing, how important this little aspect
Mhm.
is of text dependent writing, because you really have to be talking about what that text is, and you want to do it in a smart way. So that, yeah, it's kind of fascinating. That's really cool. No teacher ever went through
Yeah.
introducing or integrating sources with me, and it just wasn't happening when I was back in school. But to see that, I love the templates. I feel like that's a little closer to math and science. We always start with seeing examples on how it works, and how people, how a strong writer would do that, and going through some templates and examples. So I love those starters. I think those are awesome. I think students would love them, and I know you wouldn't have put them together if you weren't seeing success in your classroom. You have an amazing gut that it's like intuitive when you can see the students growing, and you just know this is the right thing to do, and I'm just going to keep doing this. And so,
Right.
yeah, I love it. I think it's cool. And I can see how a teacher could just start doing that tomorrow. They could take these handouts, we'll pop them on the Geek Gazette, and,
Right.
add that to a lesson, see what happens,
See what happens.
Yeah.
Well, and it's immediate confidence, and you're being transparent in your expectation. Like, this is what I want it to sound like, look like, instead of, you introduce a source. And when I first started writing, I was a very feel good focused writer, a teacher of writing. So I was like, how does it feel? You got to write your conclusion the way it feels. And I think there's, for a very, very, very small percentage of students, that makes sense in their brain. But for
Mhm.
most students, that doesn't make any sense at all. And I can't understand what you want me to do, and I'm not feeling it as much as you tell me to feel it. My favorite strategy year one teaching was read it again, and if something, when something comes to you, there's like some mystical thing that's going to happen. That's what it is, and that's how you conclude. And I would tell my young writers, keep reading until something comes to you. I was like, really? Now, as a veteran teacher with over 2 decades of classroom experience, I can tell you that, again, as cool as it sounds, it only reaches a few kids,
Yeah.
where you can tell them, like, look, this is the way I want you thinking about this. This is how
Yeah.
you can do it. And that gives them that confidence, and it gives them that roadmap to success. And again, I challenge you to go and look at academic writing. They're all going to use this style of writing, this introductory style, where we're going to introduce who we're talking about. We're going to establish the credibility of the person, because that helps my credibility as the writer. People write books about this, right? I think we mentioned They Say, I Say. If we didn't on our last podcast, it's an amazing book that we recommend, and we could put a link to that as well in our Geek Gazette. But They Say, I Say is a book written for students to help them introduce and integrate sources. And there's so many issues surrounding integrating sources, like kids not quoting and just using someone else's words, kids not
Mhm.
signaling, if you will, when someone else is talking, kids not using sources that are worth using. They're like not effective, or they're overusing sources, and the whole paper is someone else's ideas and not their own. I mean, there's just lots going on with this particular skill. If we could, well, six skills, right? Six standards
Yeah.
that we want to go after. And it's one of the reasons why Literacy Geeks made a college and career readiness handbook for middle school, where we walk kids through these different aspects of writing and integrating sources as they prepare for text dependent tasks. I think that's one of our resources that are just really handy, hole punched, ready to go in student binders. This college and career readiness handbook, I think, is just absolutely amazing, and it talks to kids as their writers. Like, what is it that, where is your position coming from in this particular argument? What do you feel about it? Why do you feel that way? Like, what are you
Mhm.
writing for? What source are you going to use? Why are you going to use that source? In a really nice way to support students. And you and I, Lee, and everyone who went to college grew up with these like writing handbooks, and they were so cool. You go to the school bookstore and you would buy I think mine was Keys for Writers or whatever. And it was such a great resource to have. So
Mhm.
we built kind of like a Keys for Writers for middle level students for both reading and writing. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah. I love all the questions that are like that. They're just, you're modeling the questions you want the student
I know they
to
just start coming out.
to their brain, right? And you're just like, you want to say this, and then you want to think of this, and you want to think of that, and I know there's a debate out there on whether these handouts
Mhm.
or even, is that the student should be creative and can be coming up on it on their own. And there's different approaches, but I know in music, when someone starts, learning how to play the piano, they don't creatively start with their own song. They get to learn, different tunes, and it's not until they've practiced the same song multiple times that they finally get to the point where they can be creative on the song and make it their own, which we hear on The Voice
Mm.
or different places on TV. Make it your own.
Right.
But you can't start there. You can't skip
Mm.
learning from how people do it well. So kind of crazy. But and then John Wooden, one of the greatest coaches ever at
Yeah.
UCLA,
Yeah.
I was reading his book, and he talks about how he teaches his kids how to put on their socks. It was mind blowing to me that why would you be teaching an 18-year-old how to put on their socks?
Right.
But
Yeah.
you know what? They're not putting them on right. They're getting blisters. They're doing this. They're doing that. And I think he learned it was all the little things that mattered the most. And
Mm.
so as we talk about this text dependent writing, we're getting down to the very little pieces of it, and really those are the important things
Mhm.
that's going to make the great writer. And then we practice those little skills like putting on your socks or learning how to play a certain song. You got to start from square one. So
Yeah, you do. And over the years I learned that we needed to spend more time with this particular type of writing and skill. And so I incorporated into my instruction nearly every day. Every time we picked up a text, we would practice integrating sources. Every time we read a poem, we would introduce something. We would talk about the metaphor, and we would, introduce, in the poem, what's the poem's name? Do we use quotation marks around the poem, or do we underline the poem? How do we know? Why do we do this? Why do we have italics now? Why do we italicize books instead of underline them? There was this thing called a typewriter. I mean, every single day, it's just hammering them on how do we talk about sources, because it's everywhere. And again, to reiterate a point that was made earlier in the show, it is what kids need most going into college. There, the ability. There's three main tasks going into college. One is the ability to read and break down a text effectively. The second is to summarize what someone has said fairly, meaning you don't just read it and then write about your own opinion or misrepresent an idea because you don't believe in it or agree with it. That you have to be able to read someone's ideas and represent it fairly in a non-biased summary. And the third is integrating sources. Those are like the three, what our research shows are three core skill sets. And so are we working on those every day with our kids? Is or is that
yeah.
just something we do once or twice a year and we move on? And then the kids are expected to be masters of this when they go into college. We're going to go
Yeah.
into one of my new favorite segments, where it's let's get techie, and there's a little bit of dance party that's going to happen, and then we're going to start in on technologies, reasons for technologies as it relates to this integrating sources, introducing sources. So we're just going to get started here. All right, nicely done. Nice, good moves. All right. So Lee, tell us about technology. And it's fascinating always talking with you because you always think about things a bit differently than I do. And so it's just amazing because the synergy, how I talk about things and think and how you do, it's amazing. And I'm always learning so much. So you go ahead and talk to us about technology in this space. What does it look like, and what do we use technology for?
Yeah, so I think I'm always listening to what I think I love to start by how you're doing it in the classroom currently, down to those little details. And as we were going through that in this podcast and preparing, the number one thing that you kept talking about, I'm like, hey, let's show it
Mm,
to the people watching the podcast, and I want you to show an example because visuals can be so great. And the first thing out of your mouth was that I don't have a document camera. I don't have a document camera. And I I've had previous conversations with you, and you love to put the article or the poem or whatever text it is, and you love to take your pencil and go through it, and then you love to model the questions that are going through your brain when you're doing it, so that they start to have those same questions, and be able to answer those things anytime they read a text, which is so beautiful. So to me, that's like the first low tech version, that of technology that if you can add to your classroom, you should, getting these kids in front of more of the texts. You say it's so important, and then modeling that. And whenever you said model, it was the fact, I think you're modeling the questions you're asking.
Mm-hmm.
You always say model, but that's more important, I think. I don't know. Do you agree with that? Or when you say model, is it something else
Yeah,
that
no,
it's really how your brain's attacking and
mhm.
learning about that text? Does that sound
Yeah,
right?
you want
Or
to model the physical, you want to model the physical strategy, and then you also want to model the cognitive work that's going on so
yeah.
that they understand decision making.
Mhm.
So why did you draw that arrow right there? Why did you underline that versus
Mhm.
circle it?
Yeah.
Why are you placing a bracket around that information? And just having those conversations and asking questions or pausing on a word and saying, that's interesting. I wonder where he's going with this, or I wonder where she's going with this. And they're like, what do you mean? She's going to the next sentence. And it's like, oh, no, no, no. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's having
Yeah.
fun with them. And it's quite engaging if you ask them to engage with you. Modeling is done in the beginning where they are observers, but then they
Mhm.
become active participants where you stop
Mhm.
and say, if I were to draw an arrow right here, what two ideas would I connect? If I were to draw a bracket around something, where would I draw that bracket and why? Turn to a
Mhm.
neighbor. And boy,
Mhm.
the engagement just explodes in the
Mhm.
classroom.
I love it. And we would see that in our trainings. I know we would go out and teach teachers, and that moment when you'd be under the document camera and you'd be teaching teacher. And that was the best, man, the best conversations were right there around that text. Or, "Oh, I don't think that author means that." And then, man, as soon as there's a little bit of disagreement,
Mm-hmm.
it was the learning was off the charts, right? It was so cool. And that was, I remember you and some of the colleagues would step back and would be like, so happy that we got here, and not like have to be right, and that was kind of a cool moment. Like, yeah, just because you're underlining something doesn't mean that student needs to, but they need to start to think in similar ways that
Right.
you're thinking. And so, yeah, I love that. So yeah, so I feel like technology, document camera, number one. Number two, digital handouts, easy way to give them, samples, templates. I know that's low tech too, but everyone usually has a Google Classroom,
Mhm.
or some place that they can store information. So we will post that in the Geek Gazette, so you can download them, pop them in if you think they're useful. Make your own, whatever you want to do. But we definitely think samples and templates and starters are so super important. And then the third thing that we've created here at Literacy Geeks is auto grading writing. So
It's amazing.
we're blown away. We love it. We think there's two possibilities. One is assessments throughout the year to kind of show where they are with that sub skill of integrating and introducing sources.
Yeah.
So we can check in multiple times a year and see the growth, and we can see that across a classroom, a site, and a district, which
Mhm.
is amazing. And then the next thing we're currently working on is the ability to do smaller tasks. So they just write a paragraph on the introducing or integrating, and we can grade and give personalized feedback right there in the moment. And we believe speeding up the personalized feedback and giving an immediate grade is the game changer needed to
Mhm.
allow them to practice and do this skill more. And
Mhm.
I think with more practice, we're going to see them grow even quicker.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think one of the flaws in my educational practice, and it's just because it wasn't available, is that even though I had 35 students in a class practicing introducing sources, I didn't always know exactly what they were writing. And I didn't know exactly if they had the comma in the right spot or
Mm,
if they put the quotation marks around the right source.
mm,
And so, or if they were quoting or paraphrasing. I would
yeah,
have check-ins. They write on the whiteboard. Let's do some grammar fixes to see where they are. Every once in a while, they write a note card, index card, introduction to something, and they would turn it in. So I got those kind of formative assessments, but I didn't have something as complete as what we have built, where it will look at all aspects right there, every single kid, and give personalized feedback. And what's most impressive is so much of this source integration stuff doesn't even show up in rubrics, but they do in ours, because we believe in prerequisite skills and we can assess based on those skills. Whereas when you assess on evidence, it's a pretty gigantic area where you could be looking at the credibility of a source, you can be looking at the adequacy of the source, you could be looking at the completeness of the source, you can be looking at how well you cited it, if you quoted it, if you paraphrase. I mean, there's just, you could drive what we like to say, drive a truck through it, right? It's just so big. So we like to really break it down. And so we have integrating sources, and you could do a quick writing that takes 6-7 minutes in class and have that auto graded and working on these 6 standards, which is just so awesome. So cool.
Yeah. Yeah. That's amazing. So, increase practice, really, number one thing. And then we talked about the other day on the last episode was data. It's not actionable. So like if I gave you a 2 out of 4 on evidence, what does that mean?
Right.
It's
Which
just
part?
not down to that level enough, right? But if if it's there are 1 out of 4 on introducing sources or attribution,
Yeah.
then we know. I feel like that's tangible. That's teachers are going to know how to create some lessons to help the students improve on that skill, and then that overall, if they get good at those sub skills, then they're going to be much better at text dependent writing.
Yeah. Awesome. I agree. So great. All right, so we're looking at next show. I think we kind of said it, and we're in agreement. We need to focus on close reading. I think what we want to do is have a segment on close reading practice and talk about how that relates to text dependent writing and how that really supports the analysis of text and getting kids ready to write. And I think that's going to be a great show. And we're excited to have you hear that one and see what kind of conversation comes out of that. So thanks for joining us today and geeking out with us. We really appreciate you as always. We look forward to next time.